Hey guys, so I'm here at home with my hockey pictures in the background and my messed up hair, and trying to do the video for what we would have covered on Monday, so that way you have this before we've talked to Newberg on Friday. So wanted to make sure I at least talk to you about research. So here you go. You can watch this whenever you want, just hopefully before Friday. And by the way, we've got two games tonight, so we'll see how Andy does at our hockey games. And if he doesn't do well, we can razz him on Friday when he's here. If he does do well, we won't mention it at all. So anyway, let me share my screen, and we can talk about research. So I do have. There is an article that I would like you guys to read. I'll post it up on Moodle, and it's from a publication called The Big Think, and it's an interesting article. It's about 5 years old, but it talks about how, believe it or not, the majority of published articles, even things that you think you can believe, you probably can't totally trust it. And that it gets into kind of the science of what type of research you can believe based on the statistics, based on what's published. So the idea of it is to be very, very careful when you are reading something about the truthfulness of it. And today, it's that's even more so when we're talking about science. So when we're talking about, for instance, we see a lot of stuff about COVID. We see a lot of stuff about vaccines. We need to take things with a grain of salt when you read them, and that's either the negative or the positive. So if you see things that say it's absolutely perfect, be careful. If you see something that says I would never do it, also be careful. And while I'm at it, I'll say be careful in what you read across the board, because not everything necessarily can be shown to be true. So this is a pretty interesting read. I'll put it on Moodle. Take a look, and maybe we'll discuss it when we're in person again. So when we look at research in relation to health psychology, we're looking at kind of how we make decisions and how research helps us make better decisions. So when we look at what we'll do for a patient, we want to make sure that everything has some type of evidence. So if we're providing a treatment, if we're providing a medication, if we're providing a consultative service, we want to make sure that these three things exist. So the first is that the right amount of research has been done, that there is evidence based in research. The other thing is that we want to make sure that we, as clinicians, are giving the right type of advice, that we have the proper expertise. And the last piece is to make sure that the client or the patient, sorry, that the patient is with you, that they feel like they're part of the treatment, that they are getting what they need. So we want to make sure that all three of those things are present when we're providing a medical related service. So that way it sort of not just protects you, but it provides a better service. What happens when you make an unscientific conclusion? So I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but it's sort of the same story. So this goes back to several Christmases ago. I mean, we're gone back a couple of years now. You probably don't even know who this person is, but we were talking at Christmas about the singer George Michael, who was really popular in the 80s and 90s. He was one of the first openly gay performers, and he was just super popular. So if you've heard of him, great. If you haven't, this is the guy. So we were talking, and he had recently died, and my mother-in-law she jumped to this conclusion that he must have died from AIDS. And it was really kind of an off the wall conclusion, based solely with the fact that the man was gay. So it's almost like, hi, Marcia, the 80s called. They want your ideas back. Because it really was not a scientific or well thought out conclusion. It was actually kind of ignorant. In reality, if you need to know, the guy died from a cardiac myopathy and a fatty liver. Had nothing to do with AIDS or an STD or his sexuality in any way, shape, or form. But she still made that conclusion. So that is something we all have to worry about or think about, and that's referred to as confirmation bias. So what this is it's we make an assumption, we make a guess based in faulty reasoning, and what happens is our mind is so set in one direction that we rule out any other possible alternatives for the observation that we make. So in this case, it was like tunnel vision. She just saw the one way of thinking and didn't even possibly imagine that it could have been anything else. So that's kind of an obvious one. There are some other, I might say to you, I think the example that I use a lot is, you picture a librarian, 50 something year old woman, glasses, kind of dressed super conservatively, hair in a pony in a bun. You kind of have the picture there. And then I show you a guy in a ripped denim jacket, big beard, like a big biker beard, long hair, tattoo on his face. And then I ask you, which of these people do you think probably listens to opera? And your guess is probably the librarian, because you're thinking conservative. It's like you just have this picture, but you really don't have anything scientific to base it on. So if I were to then tell you, no, it's the heavy metal looking guy, it's like, how about that? So we have to think about the conclusions that we make and draw them based on actual scientific principles. We can talk about this once we're back in class. What other kind of confirmation biases can you make? Maybe I'll post this question up on Moodle for you to answer. Think about where you may see people and make a snap decision based on kind of what you've learned or what you've seen or what you've experienced, but that doesn't give it all of the information. And think about mental health labels. That's a big place where you see this happen. So next we talk about what is a theory. Theories are kind of the root of all research, and a theory is really just a set of analytic statements that explain a set of phenomena. So we're going to take a guess, but we're going to use science-y statements, something that makes sense, and those statements are going to explain why something else might happen. So that's a theory. And then the question is, though, why are theories important? Why do we even care? What might be some reasons? Well, the first is the theories give you a guideline for how to do research. So it might, for example, or you might have some research that shows what components go into an intervention with somebody with breast cancer that help them cope better. So if you have a theory about what that might be, it's going to help you set up that research to determine what are the right things. So theories sort of start research. The next thing is that theories can generate predictions that you could test or modify. So when we talk about, the biggest incorrect statement when we talk about research is when I ask somebody to give me a hypothesis. And people generally know, if I were to say, what's a hypothesis? They're going to say it's an educated guess about something. You've learned that in like seventh grade biology. But when I ask somebody to give me a hypothesis, a lot of times they're going to say, why do, people get violent, or what makes video games make somebody violent? And a hypothesis is never actually a question. A hypothesis is your guess. So it is that prediction that you want to test. So a hypothesis might be playing violent video games will create violent behaviors in a person. It's a guess, it's a statement, and that statement you're going to test. So a theory is where you start out testing something. Theories also help us tie together loose ends. So this might be something like, we have a theory about what prevents relapse from using, and maybe we're going to look at things like, what type of addiction are we talking about? Smoking? Are we talking about alcohol? Are we talking about drugs? And then, are there different programs? Are there other things you see? So it really just kind of helps you hone in on research. But theories are kind of the place where you start. It's the first thing. And I tell people, especially kind of now at this stage, think about everything all the time. So as you're going through your day, notice things and notice patterns, and whether it's, hey, did you ever notice that ADHD kids all kind of look the same? They're all super skinny, kind of like wild-eyed, and at least in the schools that I went to that weren't terribly diverse, it was always like the short, skinny little blonde kid. I don't know. That's that's probably just a wrong racist statement or something. I don't know. But I always thought, like, is there something to do with the way somebody looks and ADHD? I don't know. Could be something to test. Another one, hey, this is something I always thought was really cool. If I was going to do research today, I would do research on astrological signs. Okay, call me crazy, tell me it's a whole bunch of bunk, but I think there's something to be said about the fact that I could talk to somebody and they could be kind of neurotic and have stomach issues and be a little finicky, kind of irritable. And I could be like, hey, you were born in August too. What date? And so anyway, look at things, notice things, write them down, come up with ideas, because these are the kind of things that turn into theories and research and projects and just interesting things you could do later in life. So if you have a thought, download Evernote, write that down, because at some point it'll be useful. So now we'll talk about kind of the different types of research, and there are three that we'll cover, and they all kind of get more detailed and more stringent as you go along. So the least detailed, the least scientific or descriptive studies. These are studies where you're going to observe and record behaviors and then maybe come up with a hypothesis afterwards. But this is really just like watching something and jotting down what happens. So you might do this with people, you might do this with animals, you might do this with any kind of scenario where you can watch and record something. So you think like, grade school science projects were usually descriptive studies projects where you want to see, you watch the growth of a plant. Well, no, actually, now that I think about it, a lot of times you're going to have that be an experiment. So scratch that. Descriptive, you're just watching something. I want to see, how does what time does the squirrel show up at the door in the morning to irritate my cat? I don't know. So in a descriptive study, there's a couple of things you could do, a couple of ways you could do it. So first, there's a case study. In a case study, we're going to look at one person, but we're going to look at them in depth. So we're going to collect a whole lot of information about one person, preferably over the course of their life. What's good about this is it reveals general principles. So maybe I learn a lot about, I want to do that study on the person who's a Virgo, and I learn a lot about Olivia and find out that, you know, uh, when she gets irritated, what her sleep patterns are like, what what bothers her when she's upset physically, etc. So I find a whole lot about one person, and I want to be able to generalize that and say, hey, this is kind of what I think about people who are Virgos. But the disadvantage is we're only looking at one person. What if that person is just the oddball? What if that person is the outlier and that doesn't affect, or that doesn't mean that's what Virgos are like? So is it worth it? It almost sounds like, why bother do a case study? Well, case studies are excellent for generating ideas for other studies. You find out all this stuff about Olivia and about her habits, and you think it's because she's a Virgo. And now we can do that same test to other people and see, does when they were born, does it add up? Do we see other similarities? So a case study is a good place to start. Surveys and interviews. This is often how you get information in descriptive studies, including case studies. So the thing that's awesome about it is you can find out a whole lot by interviewing people, by giving them a survey. The disadvantage, it's subjective. So if I ask you, um, do you find yourself to be very irritable? They may be like, no, not at all. I'm perfectly pleasant. And then if you were to ask everybody else that the person hangs out with, they were to be like, no, they're irritable. So it's only as good as what the person that's telling you is telling you. But it's still generally the best way of collecting information. Observational studies, these are things that you can watch or record more scientifically. So that could be structured or unstructured, but it might be something like where we hook somebody up to a heart rate monitor, or if you've ever had a sleep study done and they put the electrodes on your brain and kind of measure what happens to your body while you're sleeping. That's an example of an observational study. But the big thing is, in these, we're simply collecting information. That's all we're doing. We're not really creating a hypothesis. We're just watching things. We're just describing them. That's thus the name, descriptive studies. When you get to the point where you want to compare things, that's where you get into correlational studies. So correlational studies are going to take one thing and compare it to another and say, hey, is there a relationship between X and Y? Is there a relationship between when you're born and what your disposition is? Is there a relationship between how much dopamine you have and how many times your legs jump in the middle of the night? This is a correlation. Are they related? So if we are looking at the statistics involved in correlations, there is something called a correlation coefficient, and I will never ask you to memorize that. Just know that it's called R. And the other thing is a scatter plot, which is what it looks like when you graph out a correlation. So when you have the coefficient, it's going to give you a number when you plug it into this between -1 and +1. And that can be represented on the scatter plot here physically. And what it will show is if you are a perfect -1, then you have a perfect negative relationship. As one thing happens, another thing doesn't happen, or vice versa, excuse me. If it's a +1, it's a perfect positive relationship. The more one thing happens, the more another thing happens. If you have a 0, then there's no relationship whatsoever. And you have any range in between. So if you have a +8 or plus +0.8, it means there's a very strong positive relationship. If you have a minus -0.6, it means you have a fairly good negative relationship. I'll show you a little bit more about what that means in a minute through an example. So we've got a sad Eskimo. I'm probably not supposed to call him an Eskimo anymore. I'm probably supposed to call him an Inuit or a native Canadian or a native I don't even know, but for this case he's a sad Eskimo. And why is he sad? He's sad because he owns an ice cream shop and he's not making any money, and he lives in Alaska, and he lives in one of the cold areas of Alaska. So for any of you smartasses who are like, hey, Juneau, Alaska is actually fairly warm, I'm talking about one of the cold areas. Okay, so he's like, maybe I should have put him in Canada instead of Alaska. In any event, sad Eskimo, ice cream shop, not doing so well. Now he comes up with an idea because he reads this article that says, hey, there is a high correlation between swimsuits and ice cream. So what we see is that, the more swimsuits that are sold, generally, the more ice cream that is sold. So he comes up, he has this great idea, and he's like, okay, I'm going to get a bunch of swimsuits. And therefore, if I can sell these swimsuits, people are going to buy ice cream too. So clearly, we still have a sad Eskimo, or sad Inuit, whatever, because he's still not selling any ice cream, because he's also not selling swimsuits, because nobody needs swimsuits there. Kind of a dumb example, but the idea is that there are other variables in that go into it. Clearly, it's the weather is what we're talking about here. But we're just talking about correlations. So another thing I'm going to post up on Moodle is something called a spurious correlation, which gives you a relationship between two things that have nothing to do, but they still show a correlation. So that leads us to the next part, or the most rigorous type of research, which are experiments. And with experiments, essentially we're creating multiple conditions that differ from each other and that we can predict. So when we talk about experiments, we talk about having variables, an independent and dependent variable that we're going to assign to people or assign the different treatments, and then measure how each of them work. So I think you've all heard of or participated in or seen an experiment. But essentially what we're doing is we're going to have a control group, and then we're going to have a group, treatment group that we're going to do something with. So we'll look at this example here where the average IQ of people in general is 100. So we're going to we have this new drug called Done-It-All that is going to raise your IQ, and we want to compare it against people that we give a sugar pill or placebo to. So you've probably heard about a placebo in the past, and essentially what that is we want to show that it isn't just the expectation of somebody getting a treatment that will make them better, because there are certain times where just the idea that you're taking something makes you feel better. We want to make sure that the pill itself really works. So that's why we have a control group. That's why we give the control group a placebo. It's kind of like if you've ever played this trick on somebody where you give them, fake beer, the near beer, like O'Doul's or whatever, but you tell them it's real beer. You could really only do this with people that have never drank, but and then they start acting drunk, and that's an example of like a placebo making an effect happen. So I'm not trying to give anybody any ideas, but it's kind of funny. So anyway, in this test, we find that the control group, when you test their IQ afterwards, is still 100. Nothing changed. The sugar pill didn't make a difference. But the Done It All that I've trademarked in case I ever create a pill named after my name, we have increased IQ by 30 points, and we're able to turn people into geniuses now. So that's our experiment. It worked. Woohoo. Um, so what the experiment is basically being able to show causality. A caused B. A had an effect. They weren't just related like in a correlation. There's actually cause and effect. So if you want to show causality, this is like a horrible slide, but it has to have certain things. So if you want it to be an experiment versus a correlation, you have to be able to show that the evidence is consistent. You can replicate your study. So you want to be able to redo this over and over again. That's why things like SATs and GREs, they're consistent questions that are given to everybody across the board. You can't just willy-nilly make up a test and a college entrance test. It needs to be consistent. The causes have to be in place before the disease or whatever appeared. Well, it's kind of obvious, but if you're going to give somebody a drug that fixes a particular mutated gene that causes cancer, you have to make sure that the mutated gene is actually what's causing the cancer. Otherwise, you're not testing anything. The relationship has to make sense. So the findings have to be consistent physiologically. So they need to be, they need to be sort of obvious. There has to be a dose response relationship between risk factor and outcome. So in other words, you have to be able to tell how much does increasing a dose decrease the risk of something, and at what point does it level off. So, at what point does giving you a higher dose of ADD medicine help versus just basically turn you into a meth head? And then the strength of the association suggests causality. So again, this is not a statistics class or even a research class, but you want to be able to see how likely is it that A causes B, and how important is that relationship when I'm creating a solution. So if the drug I'm giving is going to cure cancer, and we are 99% sure of that, and there is a 75% side effect that you are going to lose all of your hair and become impotent, then you want to make sure that you're pretty certain it's going to cure that cancer. If there's a 15% chance that you're going to cure the cancer and 75% chance it's going to cause baldness and impotence, it's a much less desirable treatment. So these are just some things that when we're looking at treatment that goes into making sure that the causality is there. Then we've got different kinds of design. So you've got prospective design or prospective research. And what this is we're going to look at the correlation between what somebody has or what somebody does and what it's going to cause, the prospect in the future. So we might create a study that shows people that are hostile, people that are nasty, suffer from heart disease. So we're going to essentially look at that person now and predict for the future. So essentially, we're looking forward in time. We're going to see how does a relationship between two things happen. So this is good for when you're looking at things like risk factors. They're good for if you want to try and predict something that hasn't yet happened. Uh, so, in a situation like this, you might have an idea, and it might be kind of, this might be a tough one to say, because it's like we're going to monitor this hostile person and sort of secretly hope that they get heart disease. So your hypothesis is right. So that's not where we're trying to go with prospective design. But there may be guesses that aren't so malignant that we want to take. More likely, you may look at retrospective design, where something happens, a problem happens, a person develops diabetes, a person gets HIV, and your job as the researcher is to be the detective and to figure out what happened in that person's life that led them to that. So that's a retrospective design. And you're going to look at the risk factors that went into it and try to determine, is there a relationship between obesity and diabetes? Is there a relationship between unprotected sex and HIV? Is there a relationship between vaping and drug addiction later in life? So with retrospective, you take something that's already happened, you look back in time, and you try to design a research experiment that can predict things. A longitudinal study is similar to a case study, but what it is it doesn't necessarily have to be just one person, but what it does do is it looks at how they change over the course of their life. So we might look at a group of people, or we might look at one person, and we're going to study them at different periods in their life to see different things. So it might be risk factors for a certain type of disease, that you might find a person who smokes at 25 years doesn't have a risk of cancer, 30 years doesn't have a risk, 40 years doesn't, but when they're 50, they get cancer. So it might take 25 years to develop, but that risk was there. Or you could do it the other way around. Somebody who quits smoking, when does the risk subside? Over how many years? So that would be a longitudinal study. A cross-sectional study is going to compare groups of people at various ages at a single point in time. So it's like taking a cross-section of the world you live in. So this might be something like, we look at 9th through 12th graders. There was an actual study done that looked at risky behaviors, and it compared those people, those age groups, to other people and their risky behaviors, to try and predict, like, what can you do? You can also look at intelligence. Is there a difference between 30 somethings and 70 somethings? Is there a difference in mindset or respect or belief? Cross-sectional studies look at different groups of people that way. And again, this is a quick look at research. This is like research in under an hour. So all of this stuff would be covered in much greater depth if you're in a statistics class or a research and design class. But we're talking about all of this because we are going to see research as it relates to health, as it relates to psychology, as it relates to the both. And we're also we need to be able to make sense of those things. So unless you can understand research, you can't ingest it, you can't read it, you can't get it. So that's why we look at this at all. And so we cover research in every psychology class that I teach, because in every area of psychology, there's going to be research either to do or to read. So that's why it's important. Epidemiology is a term that means the study of the frequency, distribution, and causes of any type of disease, infectious, non-infectious. So what epidemiology does is it tries to look at how many people, what ratio of people, what percentage of people have a particular disorder, and why. So when we look at the epidemiology, it's really kind of the why behind disease. So these might be questions like, who contracts a certain type of disease? what factors determine whether they get the disease, what can be done to prevent the disease, all of that. So, where did this come from? The history of epidemiology began with John Snow during the. Hang on, wrong John Snow. That's the right John Snow. So John Snow in 1848, there was a outbreak of cholera in London, in England, and he found that in certain parts of the city there were 10 times more likely that people were getting sick. And, nowadays, it's probably, if you were to stop and think about this for 5 minutes, you probably could come up with 10 different reasons why. But this was kind of groundbreaking at the time. What he discovered was in those sections of the city, the drinking water was polluted. So people were getting cholera if they were drinking from a place that had bad water. So we could have really used Jon Snow in Flint, Michigan this year. Would have really made a big difference. But anyway, as we could tell, all Jon Snows clearly are heroes. So he noticed the data. So there you go. So that was kind of where the idea of epidemiology came. And with it brings some terms that you'll hear as you're looking through articles or what you hear on TV or Grey's Anatomy. I don't know. Morbidity is the first one. This is the number of cases of a specific illness, injury, or disability at a given time for a group of people. So the morbidity would be, an example might be saying there's 36.7 million people living with HIV around the world. That is that. Mortality, or the number of deaths due to a particular cause. So a mortality statistic would be 1.1 million people died of AIDS-related illnesses in 2015. Incidence is the number of new cases of a disease or condition that occurs during a population. So we could say there's 2 million new cases, where it's a number of people. And prevalence is a ratio, the number of diagnosed diseases over a period of time. So actually, it really those look kind of the same there, the examples. But in reality, prevalence would be more like something like 13% of people in the US have HIV. I'm just making that number up. That's not a real number. But incidence, we're talking about numbers of new cases. Prevalence, we're talking about percentages of the population. So when you compare the four, you've got number of people related to an illness, number of people who have died related to an illness, number of new cases, and percentage of cases. So if you want to be an epidemiologist, which is a cool title, epidemiologist, it just rolls off the tongue, sounds good. Part of your job might be to figure out the etiology of a disease, what starts the disease, what's the cause, and then your job is to generate a hypothesis and test it. So this might be traditional diseases, heart disease, kidney disease, lung disease, or it could be mental health disease. It could be cause of bipolar disorder, cause of schizophrenia. Anyway, an epidemiologist's job is to figure out the why. And then, like any good scientist, you're going to evaluate your hypothesis and then hopefully test the effectiveness of preventative interventions. So that way we can keep people healthy. It's another thing that when we talk about research, I know you've heard these terms qualitative and quantitative before. Easiest way of thinking about qualitative and quantitative is descriptions, and quantitative is based on numbers. So if I'm gathering qualitative information, I might be figuring out what color hair do you have, what is the size of your nose. I don't know. It's a descriptive quality. Quantitative is how many of something. How many times did your leg move in the middle of the night? How many times did you cough this week? So qualitative research, you could generally find out that information with open-ended narrative questions. What color hair do you have? How do you feel today? When was the last time you got really angry? Quantitative, I'm going to give you open or closed-ended questions on a scale of 1 to 5. How psychotic are you feeling today? On a scale of 1 to 100, how many times did you want to hit your spouse in the face today? So that would be qualitative versus quantitative. And then one last thing about research is the ethics involved. And uh, there is a book on ethics that you could read. It's kind of like The Cure for Insomnia, but it does kind of take you through all the things that a research experiment needs in order to be considered ethical. And all this stuff was missing 50, 60 years ago. You could do anything in research. It was like, no holds barred. But it boils down to these 5 things. 1, you have to have informed consent before you do any kind of research with somebody. They need to know what they're getting themselves into. 2, participants have to be protected from harm. You can't electrocute somebody. You can't inflict pain. You can't inflict psychological harm. Sounds funny, but you'd be surprised in the past what people used to do for research. So you got to keep people safe. 3rd, have to keep information confidential. Sometimes it's anonymous. It's always confidential. If it can't be confidential for some loophole, you have to let people know. 4, have to debrief them afterwards. People need to know what the results of the study are. This is one I think that slips by sometimes. You might be involved in a study and then you don't necessarily know where it goes. You should. That's part of it. You should know what the results are. And then 5, the place that is sponsoring your research, generally a university, has what's called an institutional review board or an IRB, and they're responsible for reviewing and accepting your proposal. And they will rate how risky it is and whether or not it is allowable. It'll look at who your participants are, if you're using animals, do you have the right protocols? It's going to make sure that you have all these things covered. And the IRB needs to contain people from the university, people from outside the university. A certain number of them have to be doctoral level. There are all kinds of rules as to who needs to be in this institutional review board to make sure that all of your research is on the up and up. So that is it for the research piece. What I do like to do when we're in class would be to have you put together a potential research project and kind of come up with some neat ideas. So I think what I might do is share this on Moodle and have you guys give me a really good idea for a research project you might do, just something creative, and share it with us. And maybe the one that I subjectively find to be the best, I will award you some bonus points towards something. So in any event, let me stop sharing. And so that's it for the research class on Friday afternoon. We'll talk to Andrew Newberg. Take a look him up, www.andrewnewberg.net. I believe I'll put the link on Moodle to see some of the books he's written, some of his appearances on TV. A couple claims to fame is that he sees some high-profile athletes for concussion protocols. He just had Todd Fedoruk of the Flyers, formerly of the Flyers, in. He has worked with Danny Briere and other athletes. He has been on the TV show called, oh my gosh, what's it called? Can't think of the name of it at the moment, but it's a Morgan Freeman TV show. The Story of God is what it's called. And he looked at various aspects of religion in the world. And our boy, Andy, gave Morgan Freeman an MRI and talked to him on that show. So I'll try to include a clip of that as well. So come on Friday with questions. Please come on Friday with questions. Turn your cameras on. He's taking time out of his day, so I'd really like this to be as interactive and interesting as possible for everybody involved. So please come prepared. We will talk on Friday, think about all of this stuff, and try to incorporate it when we meet with him. So that's it. Have a great day. Enjoy your Wednesday off. Sleep in. Stay up Tuesday night, whatever. That's it. And I'll see you Friday.